They expected dry wartime bread, the kind they knew from home. But on their first morning in an American camp, one prisoner bit into a slice and quietly wondered if someone had made a mistake because the bread tasted slightly sweet, almost like cake, and he could not understand why ordinary bread would taste that way in the middle of a war, which left many of them asking the same silent question. Why would a country at war make its basic food taste like a treat? When the first groups of German prisoners arrived at American camps in the Midwest, they carried with them very clear memories of wartime rations in Europe, where bread had become darker, denser, and increasingly scarce as the war dragged on. And many of these men associated bread not with comfort, but with survival, because in the later years of the war, flour was stretched, mixed, and rationed, which produced loaves that were heavy, sometimes sour, and rarely abundant. So when these prisoners entered American custody, they expected food to be strictly functional, measured, and minimal, since they assumed a nation fighting a global war would conserve every possible resource. Yet the routine they encountered began to challenge those assumptions in small but noticeable ways, especially during the quiet structure of camp mornings when trays were distributed in an orderly manner and each man received similar portions. Because the Geneva Convention required basic standards of nutrition, and the American camps generally followed those guidelines with consistency, which meant bread appeared at nearly every meal, usually sliced, pale compared to the dark loaves many Germans knew, and softer in texture than what they remembered from home. And at first this difference was observed without much thought, because hunger often overrides curiosity. But subtle details slowly became impossible to ignore as the days formed a rhythm, and the prisoners had time to pay attention to the ordinary elements of their new environment, including the smell of the bread itself, which carried a faint sweetness unfamiliar to men used to rye and coarse grains. And some prisoners quietly compared slices at the tables, pressing the bread between their fingers to feel how easily it compressed, noticing how it bounced back instead of crumbling, which signaled a different baking method and different ingredients. And while no official explanation was given during those first meals, the difference planted a small but persistent question in their minds, because taste is deeply tied to memory, and memory was one of the few possessions they still fully owned. So when the flavor did not match expectation, it created a quiet psychological friction, not dramatic or loud, but present in the background of their thoughts. And several memoirs from former POWs later describe these early food impressions as moments when they first realized they were no longer experiencing wartime Europe, but something culturally different, because American bread production at the time often used refined wheat flour and sometimes small amounts of sugar or malt to improve texture and shelf life. Practices that were common in the United States, but less so in rationed Germany. And although the sweetness was mild by American standards, it stood out to men whose palates had adjusted to austerity. And this contrast did not feel luxurious as much as it felt confusing, since they struggled to align the idea of an enemy nation with the sensory evidence in front of them. And this confusion did not erase their situation as prisoners, but it complicated the simple narratives they had carried with them, because daily life inside the camps was built on routine, predictability, and controlled movement. Yet within that structure, small experiences like food could subtly reshape perception, and bread, being present at nearly every meal, became one of the first recurring reminders that their surroundings operated by different norms, which led some prisoners to eat slowly, analyzing flavor without openly discussing it, since conversation about such topics could feel trivial compared to the reality of captivity. Yet internally, these observations accumulated, forming the beginning of a broader realization that captivity in America would not mirror the deprivation they had imagined, even though it remained captivity all the same. And in this quiet way, through something as ordinary as a slice of bread, The gap between expectation and reality began to open. As the weeks passed and the camp routine settled into a predictable pattern, the question of the bread did not disappear, but instead became a familiar curiosity that returned at each meal, because repetition has a way of turning small surprises into ongoing observations. And many prisoners began to notice that the bread remained consistent in color, softness, and flavor regardless of the day, which suggested an organized supply system rather than occasional surplus. And this consistency itself carried meaning for men who had lived through irregular shortages, since in wartime Germany, the quality of bread often changed depending on available grain and ration policies. So the stable nature of American camp bread hinted at agricultural abundance and industrial baking capacity that felt distant from their recent memories, and some prisoners quietly speculated about how such food systems worked, imagining large bakeries, transport networks, and farms far from the camp fences, because food invites thoughts about the world beyond confinement, and thinking about production and distribution allowed their minds to travel outside the limits of their daily perimeter. And in letters reviewed by censors, many prisoners described meals in neutral tones, noting bread, potatoes, and coffee without emotional language. Yet private recollections written years later sometimes admitted that these meals shaped their early impressions of American society more than any official briefing ever could. Because taste is immediate and does not require translation. And while the guards rarely commented on the bread itself, their casual handling of food distribution signaled that such meals were ordinary by local standards, not special treatment. And this normality created a subtle contrast with the prisoners' expectations of strict austerity, since they had prepared themselves mentally for a harsher environment. And when reality did not fully match those expectations, it required an internal adjustment, not of loyalty or ideology, but of perception. And perception influences morale in quiet ways, because when daily life includes small predictabilities, the mind finds anchors in routine, and bread became one of those anchors, appearing morning and evening, unchanged and reliable, and some prisoners develop habits around it, saving a portion to eat later or pairing it carefully with other items on the tray, which reflected how humans create control within limited circumstances. And control, even in minor forms, can ease the feeling of uncertainty. And camp reports from the period indicate that American authorities aim to meet caloric guidelines to maintain order and health, not to provide comfort. Yet the results sometimes felt surprisingly generous compared to late war European conditions. And this gap between intention and perception illustrates how the same object can carry different meanings depending on context. Because to the camp administrators, the bread was a basic ration component, but to the prisoners, it could symbolize stability, difference, or even cultural identity. And over time, the sweetness became less surprising and more familiar, though it never fully blended into the background for some men, since each bite still reminded them that they were far from home in both geography and daily experience. And this awareness did not necessarily soften captivity, but it added layers to how they interpreted their situation, because captivity is lived, not only through rules and fences, but through ordinary moments repeated day after day. And in those ordinary moments, the contrast between expectation and reality continued to shape their understanding of the country holding them, one meal at a time. As familiarity replaced surprise, the bread itself became less a topic of quiet comparison and more a reference point for understanding how differently food could be produced and valued in another country. Because once the initial curiosity faded, some prisoners began to think more practically about why American bread tasted the way it did. And these reflections often drew on their civilian backgrounds, since among the prisoners were bakers, mill workers, and men who had grown up around small town bakeries in Germany. And such men recognized that flour type, Milling methods and added ingredients could all influence flavor and texture, and they understood that highly refined wheat flour produced lighter bread, while darker loaves in wartime Europe often came from mixed grains stretched to meet shortages. And this technical awareness allowed them to frame the sweetness not as indulgence, but as a byproduct of a different food economy, where large-scale agriculture and industrial baking aimed for uniformity, shelf stability, and mass distribution. And these priorities shaped the final taste long before the bread reached a camp tray. Conversations on this subject, when they happened, stayed practical rather than emotional, because prisoners learned to discuss neutral topics that did not invite misunderstanding, and food preparation counted as safe ground. So a man might quietly explain how malted flour could bring a mild sweetness or how commercial yeast changed texture. And these exchanges reflected a desire to interpret their surroundings logically, since logical explanations reduce uncertainty more effectively than speculation, and speculation rarely improved life inside a fence compound. Some prisoners also noticed how the bread paired with other American foods they encountered, such as jam or peanut butter, and this pairing suggested that the bread's flavor was designed to complement spreads rather than stand alone. And this realization revealed another cultural difference, because food habits evolve together, and what tastes balanced in one cuisine may feel unusual in another. And understanding this helped some men view the bread not as strange, but as part of a broader system of eating. At the same time, the regular presence of wheat bread highlighted agricultural contrast between the United States and war-torn Europe, since American farmland had not been battlefields, and harvest continued with less disruption, which allowed food industries to maintain peacetime standards in many regions. And this stability filtered down even into POW rations, not as privilege, but as consequence of geography. And geography often influences daily life more than politics does, especially in matters of food supply. These reflections did not turn meals into moments of admiration, and they did not erase the reality of confinement. Yet they added nuance to how prisoners interpreted what they saw, because each practical explanation replaced a small piece of uncertainty with understanding. And understanding creates mental steadiness, which matters in long-term confinement. Over time, the bread's sweetness no longer raised questions at every bite, but it remained a quiet reminder that the world beyond their past experience operated on different assumptions about food, farming, and processing, and this reminder subtly widened their perspective without changing their circumstances, because perspective and circumstance do not always move together. In this way, a simple ration item became part of how they learned about their surroundings, not through lectures or official briefings, but through repeated sensory experience. And sensory experience often teaches more effectively than words, since taste and smell connect directly to memory and comparison. By the end of this stage, the bread had shifted from mystery to understood difference, and this shift illustrates how adaptation works in small increments, where repeated exposure turns unfamiliar details into accepted facts, and those facts quietly build a more complex picture of daily life in a foreign country during wartime. A picture shaped not only by rules and guards, but also by the ordinary items placed on a tray each morning. As months passed and the routine of camp life settled into a steady rhythm, the bread continued to appear at nearly every meal without variation. And this consistency slowly shifted its role from curiosity to background, because the human mind cannot remain focused on the same difference forever, and what once felt unusual gradually becomes part of the expected pattern when repeated often enough. Yet even as the sweetness no longer surprised them, the bread still carried quiet meaning as a marker of how different their surroundings were from the Europe they had left behind, since daily food is one of the most direct reflections of a society's resources and habits. and the reliability of these rations demonstrated a level of logistical stability that contrasted with the late war instability many prisoners remembered from home. Within the camp, mealtimes were among the few moments structured around shared POWs rather than assigned labor. And because of this, prisoners often became more observant during meals than during work details, noticing portion sizes, preparation styles, and small consistencies that revealed how the system operated, and the bread's uniform quality suggested centralized baking and organized distribution. Since variation usually signals local improvisation, and organized systems tend to produce uniform results, and recognizing this allowed some prisoners to infer how large-scale food networks functioned in the United States, even without seeing them directly. For men who had lived through ration cards and substitutions, the absence of sudden change itself felt noteworthy, because unpredictability had shaped their expectations, and when unpredictability did not appear, it required a mental adjustment, not of comfort, but of interpretation. And interpretation influences how a person mentally situates himself in a new environment, especially one defined by limits and rules. Some prisoners developed personal routines around the bread, such as trading portions, saving a slice for later, or pairing it carefully with other foods. And these small choices represented attempts to maintain agency, because agency can exist even in narrow spaces when individuals make decisions about the details available to them. And food often becomes a practical arena for such choices, since it is both necessary and immediate. Guards and kitchen staff treated the bread without ceremony, distributing it with the same neutral efficiency as other items, and this neutrality reinforced that the bread was not intended as a signal or privilege, but simply as a standard component of meals designed to meet nutritional guidelines. And understanding this reduced the temptation to assign symbolic meaning where none was intended, which helped maintain realistic expectations. Still, the bread quietly shaped impressions because repeated sensory experiences build familiarity, and familiarity influences perception over time, even when people do not actively reflect on it. And thus the sweetness became one of many subtle cues that their environment operated on a different baseline of supply and taste than what they had known during the war years in Europe. These observations did not change their status as prisoners and did not lessen the fact of confinement, yet they contributed to a gradual accumulation of practical knowledge about the society around them. And practical knowledge provides orientation, and orientation supports mental balance in long-term captivity. By this stage, the bread no longer raised questions at the table, but remained a quiet contrast stored in memory, a reminder that ordinary life varies across countries, and that such variation continues even during global conflict, shaped by land, industry, and local habit more than by ideology. In this steady progression from surprise to acceptance, the bread illustrated how adaptation often happens without announcement, turning differences into routine and routine into background, where it quietly remains as part of daily life without demanding attention, yet still contributing to a broader understanding of the unfamiliar world beyond the camp fence. As their time in the camps stretched from months into longer periods, many prisoners reached a stage where daily differences no longer felt like constant comparisons to home, but instead formed a separate frame of reference, because the mind, when exposed to the same environment for long enough, begins to treat that environment as its temporary normal. And within this adjustment, the bread they once questioned became simply the bread they were given, neither remarkable nor symbolic, yet still carrying quiet informational value about the country producing it. Since food systems reflect agriculture, industry, and distribution networks more than individual choice, and recognizing this helps some prisoners understand that what they were experiencing was less about generosity and more about how American food production functioned at scale during the 1940s. Among the prisoners were men who had worked in trades connected to food supply before the war, such as milling, baking, or transport. And these men sometimes shared practical observations about how grain quality, refining processes, and commercial baking standards influence texture and flavor. And these discussions framed the bread as a technical product rather than a cultural mystery, which reduced speculation and grounded their understanding in process rather than perception, because process offers explanation while perception alone invites interpretation. They also recognized that wartime America, unlike much of Europe, had not seen its farmland turned into battlefields, and this geographic reality allowed harvests and food industries to operate with fewer disruptions, which in turn affected what appeared on a tray inside a POW camp. And this chain of cause and effect illustrated how distant factors can shape immediate experience, even for people living within confinement. The bread, therefore, became one small example of how global war does not create identical conditions everywhere, and that variation can be observed through ordinary items as much as through official reports. And for prisoners trying to understand their surroundings, such observations provided quiet orientation rather than comfort, because understanding a system does not change one's place within it, but can make that place feel more predictable. Some prisoners later recalled that the most striking part was not the sweetness itself, but the reliability, because reliability contrasts sharply with scarcity, and scarcity had defined much of their recent past, and this contrast highlighted how quickly the mind notices stability when it has lived without it, even if that stability exists within a controlled environment. Still, the bread never erased the reality of being far from home, and it never softened the awareness of uncertainty about the future, yet it functioned as part of the daily structure that allowed life to proceed in an orderly way. And order, even imposed order, can reduce mental strain compared to chaos, and camp administrators understood this when designing consistent rations. Over time, the sweetness blended fully into expectation, and expectation removed the need for reflection. Yet memory quietly recorded the difference, storing it as part of a larger picture of how life in America contrasted with wartime Europe. And these stored impressions would later shape how former prisoners described their experiences when looking back with distance. By the end of this period, the bread represented neither surprise nor message, but context, a practical detail that helped explain how resources and geography influenced daily life. And this context added depth to their understanding without altering their confinement, because knowledge and circumstance often move on separate tracks. In this way, a simple food item completed its journey from unfamiliar taste to accepted routine, illustrating how adaptation works through repetition and explanation, and how even small details can quietly expand a person's awareness of the world beyond his previous experience, one ordinary meal at a time. In the end, the bread did not change their situation, did not shorten their captivity, and did not carry any hidden message. Yet it remained one of those small details through which the difference between expectation and reality became clear, because the men had prepared themselves for strict austerity and instead encountered a food system shaped by different land, harvests, and industrial methods. And this contrast revealed that daily life in another country could follow its own logic even. During a global war, what began as a quiet question about sweetness gradually turned into a practical understanding of how agriculture, milling, and large-scale baking influenced what appeared on a tray, and this understanding replaced speculation with context, which helped them interpret their surroundings calmly rather than emotionally, since context reduces uncertainty more effectively than assumption. For the prisoners, the lesson was not about liking a flavor, but about recognizing that ordinary items reflect the societies that produce them, and that recognition added nuance to their view of the country holding them, showing that wartime conditions were not identical everywhere, and that geography often shaped daily life as much as policy did. The bread eventually blended into routine, losing its novelty as repetition made it familiar. Yet the memory of that first difference stayed with some of them, because first impressions tend to anchor how people remember new environments, especially when those impressions are tied to the senses. Many physical traces of POW life faded after the war, but impressions carried in memory lasted longer, and small experiences like these helped form the personal accounts later written by former prisoners. Accounts that describe captivity not only through rules and fences, but through everyday details that revealed cultural contrast. And so the story of the slightly sweet bread settles as a modest example of how adaptation works, showing that even in confinement, people continue to observe, compare, and learn, and that history is often experienced through ordinary moments as much as through major events. With a simple slice of bread, quietly illustrating how different worlds can meet across a table during time of war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.